Hey, Chris. Okay, everyone's just coming in now.
Oh, muted. Hey, how are you?
Okay. Oh, all right. Okay, I've got 9:59. Close enough. All right. Hello, everybody. We've got Chris and Paishini and Peter coming in. Hopefully, a few more folks will come in as well. I'm glad to see Peter because Peter will be presenting his work in progress, his paper on détournement and sample culture. And I'm going to have to sit in my hands and mute my microphone because this is my jam. So, but I will allow you to present. As much as possible, I don't mind doing the same, having the same structures we did last week, where we kind of come in and formulate questions based on what Peter will have discussed, like we did last week with you, Chris. I think that seemed to work because it kept us kind of, it kept it topical, and we were able to address things sort of right then and there, rather than trying to keep a long list of questions that we might have forgotten how we got there, these kinds of things. Yes, as well, it's good, because the other thing too I wanted to do before we start. Now, I still would like to give as much time as necessary for Peter's presentation, but I wanted to just provide some commentary on the over here, the very lengthy and dense article by Stephen Hastings Kings. This one here from Project Muse, the international situations, international socialisme ou barbarie, and the crisis of the Marxist imaginary. Because like the Rasmussen article, it's dense in the sense that it provides lots of work in terms of final paper. Okay, fantastic. That was the whole idea. That was really what I was hoping that was going to be the next step, was to incorporate, certainly not all of the comments, because I mean, I have a tendency to fly off the handle and go in 10 different directions. And at the end of the day, I have my students going, well, sir, what's the important part? I don't remember. So if you were able to find some useful information, fantastic. So to get back to Hastings King, sounds like an emperor. Hastings King, the article, what I found really useful in it was, in the same way the Rasmussen article situates, pun intended, the SI in that revolutionary art arc. Here we have them situated in that political or the revolution and Marxist thought. So those two alone, if you come away with anything else, those two essays are the ones that hopefully you'll have a chance to go back and look at and say, yeah, there was something substantial here, because I've got to realize and understand how they are positioned relative to other thinkers. And France, being France, is not a complicated country or a complicated situation, but when you find out the nuances of changes in attitude and opinion and changes in theory, you see exactly how, Judith just came in, just how we end up with a situation such as these guys. Now, as I was reading through Hastings King paper, I was reminded of Eagleton's ideas, the four subjects that we look at, right? The pure class subject, the idealized class subject, the fractured libidinal disordered subject who likely needs therapy, and the revolutionary subject. Those four characters, in particular, the struggle between the idealized, which is more along the S&B group, the socialism and barbarisme, we'll just call them S&B and make it easier. They tend to be more towards that pure class or idealized subject, which in the end really creates a kind of impasse, right, as to the changes that are happening on the ground. Now, on the other hand, we have at least an attempt to create a revolutionary subject with the SI. So we have, on the one hand, sort of art and cultural criticism and dissent, that's the SI, and the SB, who are more sort of working class proletariat. And together, the SI managed to combine these two things, and therein lies its kind of its roots, its history, because Debord at one point in the early 60s, 60 to 61, actually was a member of the SB, and probably took a lot from them, because we see how the SI changes its perspective in the early 60s. This is why we see more talk about art. The surrealists, as much as they might be slamming them, they're learning from them, right? They're learning from their mistakes. But what happens is when they encounter and engage with the SB, they take it to the next level, right? Then the next level is taking this sort of revolutionary art idea and harnessing that onto their revised version of Marxism. So that's what I mean. It's kind of tough going. I'm just kind of give you like, if I don't know if you guys, but this is how I write things out in little diagrams and arrows and things, so I can see, oh yeah, it leads to this. So what we have is the SB, which is kind of focused on the workers' movement, bureaucratic capitalism, society as direct democracy, ideas that we certainly see in the SI. And what the SI does, and Debord in particular, is it takes, Maxwell just came in, it takes these ideas and harnesses them onto a revised version of Marxism, presented primarily by Lukács, right? Lukács's idea of reification. So it combines these two things together. Which is why Hastings King calls Debord's approach a kind of collage approach, which is interesting because it's not quite cherry picking, but at the same time, it is combining things, right? It's combining the work of the SB, an acknowledgement of the impasse, that aporia they hit when all of a sudden the workers' movement doesn't match up with the pure idealized version that they were working with. Suddenly there's a disjunction between the two. So the SB developed a kind of a variation of the Marxist revolutionary theory that was really kind of kickstarted and changed because of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. So we have, over this time period, of course, now we're looking sort of the 50s. That was only 30 years, more or less, after the Russian Revolution, and which was the result of workers there, I mean, farmers and peasants and so on. But the revolution occurs in such a way that when we see it happen roughly 35 years later in Hungary, it looks totally different, right? You've got workers' councils, you've got sort of a different configuration of workers with intellectuals, you've got sort of different alignments. And so what happens is suddenly the success, however short-lived, of the Hungarian Revolution kind of lends credence to this revised view of Marxism. And the other issue too is between this, you've got Stalin that comes into power following the death of Lenin in roughly 1928. Stalin changes the focus of Marxism from an international, global sort of, agenda to a very local, we'll say, country. So it becomes national communism rather than international. So the end result is we have changes in Marxism. Its focus changes, and its flexibility, right? What's Breton talked about, or we talked about a couple of weeks in his paper written in 1935, that Marxism, had this flexibility and an ability to call out a problem and often make the problem the starting point of a new version of it. And essentially, that is kind of what Debord does. He sees the impasse that the SB have with the workers' movement because it doesn't look the same anymore. And Debord uses that as his new position, right? The foundation of his ideas. So in all of this, if that isn't confusing enough, within France itself, we have an actual communist party, right? With the PFC, the Parti Communiste Français. Nothing is as cool as seeing posters for fascist parties and communist parties during an election. I just happened to be in France in 1984, the one and only time, and there was an election. And it was just really remarkable to see posters that were, lined up with all the other ones, because these guys, their left and right goes really far in both directions. So the French Communist Party was quite powerful. And especially following the Second World War, the alignment that they had with Russia in order to successfully win the Second World War really gave that party credence there. There was time to sort of move ahead and really get make some gains in the attitude of people. The membership went through the roof. It seemed to be like the place to be. So we have on the one hand, and again, that's a little vertical diagram. You've got Stalin, dogmatic thinking, nationalist thinking, and looking to the past. We have on the other hand, Lenin and Trotsky, who then used what Castoriadis would later call the imaginary, right? Trying to think of new ways to get over these particular impasses that were presenting themselves historically and looking to the future. So these are the two sort of strains within Marxism. And clearly the SI aligned with Lenin, the imaginary in the future, and move away from this kind of dogmatic thinking. And what really kind of accelerates this process is the short-lived success of the Hungarian Revolution. Probably lasted about as long as the Paris Commune of 1871, right? Roughly 2 months. So we have suddenly the Workers' Council, we have the notion of direct democracy, much like the Paris Commune had instilled very quickly. So the SB are energized by this, right? They say, okay, this new form of thinking is valid. We see it at work. It looks different than the Russian Revolution, but it has some credence. So what happens is we have these kind of two viewpoints. We have the kind of the negative critical on the one hand, of which the SB were part of, and certainly the SI very much a part of. And then we have the positive revolutionary forms of thinking. And I will argue that the SB shift from the center and slightly too much to the negative critical in much the same way as the SI. I think last week we talked about the paucity, right? The lack of actual revolutionary, guidance. Situations are fine, détournement and dérive are fine, and psychogeography is fine. But would that in the long term lead to truly revolutionary action? The short answer is no, right? It was certainly something they thought about. And by the early 60s, after their encounter with the SB, that becomes sort of something they set aside, and they move on to something new, which is to begin theorizing about the potential revolution that's coming up. And although Debord was talking about the fact that there was no discussion of revolution, there certainly was in Hungary, later in Czechoslovakia, and Algeria in the 1950s. So it wasn't as if revolution was not being discussed. It just wasn't being discussed in France, right, about the French population. Because as this is going on, the workers, like the working class, will say, or the workers' movement, kind of settles into a sort of complacency. The word in the essays, embourgeoisement, which is they become bourgeois. And what they do is they become bourgeois in the sense that they have some extra cash, right? Automation gives them free time. They've got some extra cash to spend. They can do things. And of course, it works because now there's no more thought of, we must revolt. So, well, no, I'm saving up for a motorcycle, right? And so the attitudes start to change. So in all of this in the 1950s, which is the context for SB, as well as the context for the very early SI, we have workers experienced, and then or experiences being discussed in the SB. We have it's sort of the worker avant-garde, which is now sort of really dissipating because there isn't a whole lot of avant-garde thinking in the workers' movement. And then finally, the self-critical writings, which would be the members of the SB themselves, who are cultured, educated, urban, and yes, they're Marxist, but they're not workers. And there's a disjunction, right? And that disjunction becomes increasingly obvious as time goes on throughout the 50s, that what the SB are discussing is this ideal subject. And the SI are noticing that, okay, there are revolutionary potentials here. What we need to do is unhinge this, the consumer identity of the worker and put the revolutionary identity back on them. And that's essentially what the work is. So that Marxist imaginary that Hastings King talks about, that's the kind of crisis that is going on. How do we get around it? And so in, where are my books? Okay, anyway, they're here somewhere. Anyway, the point is, Castoriadis talks about it at length in the essays that are discussed and mentioned in the paper. And he tries to sit down to articulate a way in which collectively, right, because this is the workers' movement, but it has to be society. Castoriadis is certainly not unaware that these people live in a society. So whatever changes occur are the social imaginary. What ideas can society come up with to better itself? And the way in which it's looked at is, well, if it can come from the workers' movement, that's fine, but it can also come from elsewhere. It can also come from revolutionary art criticism, for example. So what we end up with is the artist, right, as a kind of radical subject. Radical subject, and I just wrote it down like in front of trying to assimilate the trade unions, the way in which they were now being sort of brought into the middle class, right? Because workers were not just the working class, they were now middle class. They had the spare time, they had the cash, they had some leverage. So there is the radical subject trying to fight that, trying to fight the dogmatism that was connected with Stalinism. That's now finally petering out, and of course, accelerated when Stalin dies. But for Debord in particular was this growth of mass consumer culture. So with Debord, he thought the best way to fix this would be to remind the worker that they have that revolutionary potential. They're not just consumers. And one of the ways in which they can do it is to harness art to articulate new forms of desire and make them realize that these needs that they have should be true human needs, right? Truly human needs. And that's Marx going back to 1844, right? To early Marx, right? Identifying truly human needs rather than desires created by the spectacle. So what Debord was looking at as he was engaging with the SB was the fact that these desires were being sort of disempowered, being ignored, being sublimated and dissipated into other things. And we talked last week about, the notion of happiness. How can we define happiness if we're not really sure what it is? And all of us kind of struggled to try to figure out a definition of happiness. And all we could come up with was different versions of this same sort of idea, because each of us with our lived reality have a different idea of what makes us happy. And of course, at different points in our life as well. The notion of happiness is also historical. What made me happy at the age of 8 is going to be different than 30, than 60, and so on. So Debord sees that as one of the first things we need to do is clearly identify what is a desire versus what is a need, and make sure that that need or that desire is truly human, right? It comes from within. It's not broadcasted to us through that consumer culture. So revolutionary art, which is what Debord thought was going to be a strategy, was this deployment, right? A free creative activity in a context where the separation of performer, artist, and spectator has been broken down. And hopefully, I think, Peter, you might discuss that in sample culture, the fact that it can be something that in theory anyone could do, right? You just have to have a good ear to find stuff. So the radical change, right? This is for Debord, unharnessing the spectacle away from the spectator, and the spectator is for Debord the worker. So what is happening here? Are we talking about Maxwell, or just sort of in general? Okay. Okay. So the radical change that Debord is wishing to instill, right, is that relationship between the spectator and the spectacle. And this is what the work really begins in earnest. And it begins in art just for that reason. If we can articulate these particular ideas through art and realize them, right, present them to people, I would like to be able to sort of point it out as this is one of the main ideas that is in the text. So I'm just going to wrap up here. So what does Debord want to do? He wants to make this radical subject public and political. All right, those two things. Now the thing is, you've got to create the social space in which these actions are going to take place. And what the SI take from surrealism is the way in which surrealist art could shock the viewer. The SI wished to take that ability to shock and bring it out onto the street, bring it out in public into that social space, and make that kind of behavior revolutionary. Now, long term, we're not sure, but certainly we can agree that there was a kind of a limit as to the number of really good long-term strategies that the SI could present to us that would instill permanent change, right? A change that was going to really benefit everyone, but also would turn that dominant order upside down. Because remember, all this work is occurring from within, right? From within this dominant order. So it has to be done in a strategic kind of way. And certainly détournement is one, culture jamming is another one. But does this lead to something long-term? Well, the jury's still out, right? This is an ongoing project. So I just wanted to kind of point these things out. Though the main idea for Debord was to reject the spectacle. and the spectacle was already there. And I don't know what I've done. Yeah, okay, right here. So this is not to say that Castoriadis, this book right here, Political and Social Writings. This is volume 2 that contain the 2 essays that are discussed in Hastings' Hastings' essay. And I just wanted to mark down this little section here, and then I will stop. The crisis of capitalism has reached the stage where it becomes a crisis of socialization as such. And this crisis affects the proletariat as much as other strata of the population. So again, Castoriadis is noticing that it isn't just the workers, it's society in general. Collective methods of action, whatever they may be, are emptied of their content and collapse. This is equally true of disinterested activities. For example, popular festivals, a creation of humanity from time immemorial, tend to disappear as a social phenomenon in modern societies. They now survive only as spectacles. So the language is already here. This spectacle, a physical conglomeration of individuals no longer positively communicating with each other. They're alienated, but merely coexisting through their anonymous and passive juxtaposed relations. In such events, only one pole of people is active nowadays. Its function is to make the event live for the others, who are just onlookers. The show, a performance by a specialized individual or group before an impersonal and transitory public, thus becomes the model for contemporary socialization. That's a spectacle. And he wrote this in 1960. So with a kind of exchange of ideas, because he writes this the same year that Debord is a member of SB. So this was originally an essay. The dates here, this was done in 2 parts. I'm going to get right to the beginning of it. Originally published, Le Mouvement Révolutionnaire dans le Capitalisme Moderne, in December of 1960, and then April of December 1961, exactly the time that Debord was there. So clearly he's rubbing off on them, right? His thoughts are there. So each person is passive in relation to the community and no longer perceives the other as a possible subject of exchange. And there's Lukács's reification. Communication and cooperation, but only as inert bodies limiting his own movements. So I just wanted to read just that one passage. So we see the SB at least responding to a certain degree to ideas presented by the SI, but eventually the impasse created by the workers' movement not matching up to this sort of pure or ideal state that the SB were working with, that eventually led to the collapse of Castoriadis saying, look, we got to push this further. And the other thinkers said, well, no, I think we need to stick with this sort of this pure model. And eventually SB split. It split over that particular idea. So I just wanted to kind of present an overview of this essay. As I say, it's dense, but I think also very useful because it really helps us to ground the SI in a very specific social and political context that takes into account Stalin, the dogmatic view of Marxism that he had, the Hungarian Revolution in the mid-50s, its impact on the SB, the impact of the SB on Debord and the SI, and how they kind of take all of this and harness all these ideas to this revolutionary critique of art. So that's kind of the long and the short of it. As if that wasn't enough, last thing is the fact that modernity is occurring at the same time and sort of creeping along in behind, kind of gluing all this together. And I say that because this other book here, Georges Bollandier, Le Détour, in French it's the detour, right? Détournement, power and modernity. And he says here in the very last chapter, the imaginary in modernity, the very first sentence, modernity appears to abolish the imaginary, or at least it seems to be overcoming the landscapes and the countryside. But this idea that the imaginary is being abolished by, or not abolished, but crushed by modernity. So as this crisis of the Marxist imaginary is going on, there is a general crisis of imagination, period, in France at this particular time. Now, the Bollandier book came out in 1985, but there seems to be a real preoccupation with the French and modernity, because just 2 others in my library, Mechanique book, Modernité, Jean Chénaud, De la Modernité, like really concerned with the way in which the social imaginary was being crushed by modernity. And modernity seemed to sort of put blinders on people and stop them from imagining this alternative way of living, because ultimately all they wanted to do was create more and more consumers. And that ultimately is the reason why Debord thinks that the best way to attack this issue is to attack the consumer end of it and say, well, if we live in a consumer culture, let's try to take that apart and see if we can, create something new as a result of it. So that was my sort of overview of the readings and trying to sort of harness them to the other things we've looked at, because I know that the material, like I said, the essay was really helpful. Just want to make sure I unpacked it properly because it covered a lot of ground. Okay, so at this point now, I'd like to hand over the virtual stage here to Peter and his presentation on détournement and sample culture. I don't know, Peter, if you've taken it further, but that was kind of the working title that I had. But now I'd like to just basically stop talking and let you take over.
All right, cool, thank you. Yeah, so I guess I want to start. I guess it's necessary to preface with a few things. First is a methodological quasi-justification for what I'm trying to do. So the SI does not exist anymore, presumably, unless they're in some secret underground catacombs. And I'm not really all that interested in Debord himself or the various other members, like and their thinking and their plans and their schemes. I don't really care. And so I view my role here as like a vulture. And I'm kind of going at the corpse of the SI and just picking various ideas that I think are interesting, and whether or not they actually map onto the SI's original usage, again, is something I don't really care about. And I'd be willing to defend that that cherry picking, as Hastings would call it. I'd be willing to defend that intentional maybe misreading, if we want to get into what they mean by détournement versus what I mean by détournement. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of flexibility between the SI's use of some of these terms and how I will use some of the terms. And so I guess the second point is my starting point for this project is not necessarily the SI or détournement as such, but rather the earlier concept of the cut-up method by Tristan Tzara, and from the 1920s, which as was formulated in How to Write a Dadaist Poem. The method for writing a Dadaist poem is to take a newspaper, take scissors, cut out the words, put them in a hat, shake the hat, and draw various words out, and put them on a page, and then read them. And now that's obviously a bit laborious in the 21st century, and there are automated ways to do that. And so just an example of like what that looks like. I'll just read an excerpt from a cut-up I made of the first paragraph of the SI's Wikipedia page. And an example is, of avant-garde were derived primarily modern and comprehensive international organization of social revolutionaries made SI was and the early 20th in 1972, 20th in 1972, and then it goes on and on. So I think then the way I want to, that just sets up the first epigraph that I think is important. And William Burroughs was especially noted for using this method. him and Brian Geisen in the 60s cut up words as well as audio, and they had the idea that that when you're cutting into things, you're allowing the future to seep into the present. As Burroughs said, this is not a direct quotation, but something along the lines of the cut-ups seem to refer to things that hadn't happened yet. And so Burroughs notes in his cut-up discussions in 65 that, quote, when you cut into the present, the future leaks out. And so I'm really interested in this temporal aspect. And so we jump from Burroughs to like 40 standard years, quote unquote, later, with Common and Common's song "The Sixth Sense," where Common notes that, quote, I start thinking how many souls hip hop has affected, how many dead folks this art resurrected. And I see that as a relatively interesting link, which I'll get into more. And so what I'm interested in and focusing on is how early sample culture, if we want to use that term, I'm not sure how accurate saying, like, labeling it as a culture would be, but early sample techniques, how they took elements of the past, spliced them into sonic elements of the present, and created a new future. And in this sense, the like elevator pitch thesis of my project that I would probably refuse to expand. I mean, I will expand upon it, but if I were in an elevator and I told this to somebody, I would not expand upon it, as I would say, Grandmaster Flash is the most famous time traveler. And then just leave it at that. And then I would leave them, I would leave the elevator and they would be left there. Now, but I think that's very I think that's true insofar as Flash, in his Adventures on the Wheels of Steel from '81, took a bunch of different songs from Queen, Blondie, voiceovers from Flash Gordon from the '60s, and integrated them into this 7-minute masterpiece that that like sonically traverses this whole range of time from the 60s to the 80s, as well as portending a future where Flash himself is like this sonic god. And I think this same general activity is really seen in a lot of the early instantiations of sampling as well. And so I guess I want to draw two lines. One is a like temporal disjunction, and the other is I'll use this phrase with some hesitation, political resistance. And so in the first scenario, the temporal disjunction scenario, I think that what's interesting to look at is, and what I am trying to look at is how we have a bunch of dead artists, musical artists primarily, or people doing voiceovers, or old TV shows, old radio broadcasts, etc. that have lost relevance in various aspects of culture and various aspects of life, and they fade into obscurity. And then you have so-called crate diggers digging through crates of vinyl records, rediscovering these long lost gems and reincorporating them into a new social milieu. And probably the most famous example is the drummer for James Brown, Clyde Stubblefield, and his song Funky Drummer, which the drum line became the basis of, like, I mean, I would hyperbolically say every hip hop song, but that's not true. But like Public Enemy's Fight the Power and Rebel Without a Pause, and like it's literally sampled hundreds of times. And as a very young Will Smith, before Will Smith had his acting career, and when he was rapping under the name The Fresh Prince, said, quote, they say that sampling or imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So let's take James Brown, for instance. James Brown was finished. James Brown was old. Rap and sampling made James Brown new again. And I think that gets at half of the issue, that we get these dead old pieces of detritus. Maybe that's probably a bit rude. The detritus of culture, rather. And you bring them into the present milieu based on how an individual artist sees their work, and how it can be incorporated. But I also think that that as one creates a sample collage, that one is also portending a future to come, a new way of existing, or a new sonic terrain. And I think this doesn't just like, we can look at this purely in the instrumentals of Jay Dilla's very futuristic, like, Donuts album, but we can also look at it in the context of lyrics and, like, Busta Rhymes' Extinction Level Event, really, like, portraying this, like, negative dystopic future. And so I think there's a lot more to say on that. We could, like, run down the path of, like, how hip hop creates or determines futures, either by talking about Sun Ra, talking about Busta Rhymes, or a myriad of other people. But I think it's also worthwhile to talk about how, like, how is sampling in a type of détournement. And so, according to the rigid reading of détournement by the SI, in the SI anthology, that détournement is taking written aspects of the past, or previously written things that don't express some truth, and rearranging them to express some actual truth about the modern condition. And so, for example, I think the cut-up technique certainly fits in with that. But there are like instances of culture jamming and other the ad busters, et cetera, et cetera.
So Peter, I just want to ask you a question at this point here. When you're saying that the fact of the culture at this point, depending on historically where you're looking, early on, one of the sort of side effects of sampling and hip hop was the fact that this was one of the first times that that particular culture, Black culture, for example, was able to speak in the mainstream, right? Was able to speak to others that were not experiencing exactly the same thing. And of course, and I don't want to be facetious in any way, but I'm representing, right? I'm representing is really what that was about. And the vehicle through which they did it was through hip hop culture and through sampling. So rapping was now attached onto sampled sections of songs, and it became a kind of vehicle to break apart that monolithic white spectacle and say, look, there's room for different voices. I think that's one of the really successful ideas that we can bring to, looking at the SI and some of the theories they had and hip hop cultures, how it broke that monolithic spectacle and made room for these other voices. I don't know if you wish to address that in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a correct way of reading early hip hop culture, but I would go further to and say it wasn't. It's not merely that like sampling allowed like Black Americans to have their voice be heard in the like mainstream music industry, but rather it was crucial to the formation of this new type of music insofar as like when you have a group of people, and in this case it was primarily Black Americans who were under siege via the crack epidemic, and there was systemic inequalities, and you have a lack of money. You can't like it's not all that easy to afford a whole plethora of instruments. Like buying like forming a band and having like a couple high quality guitars, bass, drum set, et cetera, is gonna cost not an insignificant amount. Whereas as the Bomb Squad from Public Enemy notes, you can go down to the record store, you can pick up a $5 like Hall & Oates record or a $5 James Brown record, and you have all of that right there.
Mm-hmm.
You have all the instruments you can want, and so all the instruments you want, and so as you're creating your music, you're creating this this band that's bigger than you could possibly get in any other sense. I can't remember who said it right now, but like James Brown becomes part of your band, Clyde Stubblefield becomes part of your band. They like you snatch a riff from Van Halen and suddenly he's part of your band, et cetera, and like I think all of these are also very interesting. If we want to talk about the spectacle, which I guess we do because we're talking about the SI, that also is interesting insofar as like there's a reappropriation of white artists by Black artists, and so specifically, like let's take Queen for example. Glam rock, super white, super classic, get just like to use to use what Marx said of Hegel, flipping Hegel on his head. Grandmaster Flash flips Queen on their head. in his adventures on the Wheels of Steel. And I think we see that throughout, not just early instances of sampling and hip hop culture, but we see that like continuously throughout hip hop as such. And
Now, is it possible to say that it's a kind of reappropriation in the same way that Elvis took what was this at that time called race records, and homogenized them and whitened them, and he and Pat Boone would be singing songs that would have been originally written for R&B artists that would never get heard on regular radio. The tables are turned again, right? The metaphor you're using of turning it on its head, it is reappropriated the same way that white took from black culture, black now takes back from white culture and reappropriates it into this brand new format. That's part of what I like about certainly the early hip hop. And at that point, because there wasn't as much money being made from it, you could make your sample a bit more obvious, right? And of course, as it becomes more popular and more money's being made, samples seem to become more and more obscure. It becomes something like, only the in the know are going to recognize this little riff from the Delphonics from 1973, et cetera, et cetera. It seems as the more money it makes, the more obscure the samples have to be, simply because you may not have enough money for insurance, but you definitely won't have enough money to hire a lawyer when you get dragged into court for plagiarism. So it seems to really be it responds well to historical situations, because really when we talk about the way in which sampling culture starts in New York City in sort of mid to late 70s. New York's a kind of shithole, right? It's like it's in rough shape, really rough shape, and the original block parties were so bad, and the people had so little money that the few that could afford turntables would actually set them up. And I don't know if you allude to this in your paper or knew of this, but what I found really remarkable was they would set it up in a block party. They would set it up next to a street lamp, and they would, if you ever see a street lamp, those little metal covers, they're about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. They would rip those things off, and somebody would be brave enough to tap into the wiring, because there's power going to these things, and would use that to run their amps. So I'm going, man, that kicks ass. That is so cool. So this is what I mean, these very sort of reappropriations of things that like power, like the social space of the city block, right? The block within the neighborhood. And from there, you end up using sampled music, which at that point was just simply for fun. It didn't matter who it was. And typically, the more recognizable it was, the better the song would be, and the more people would enjoy it. But the moment it moves out of those neighborhoods, Brooklyn and elsewhere, and it begins to really make serious money in the early 80s, suddenly the attitude towards sampling changes, mostly because lawyers get involved. So I just wanted to raise that point. I mean, whether you allude to it, but there is, in the beginning, something quite remarkable that was really sort of taking it to the streets, using what was there, like literally power coming from streetlights to run their gear.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so yeah. So I think there are a few points to note. I mean, like that's I did the and the last point of quote unquote taking it to the streets and using power was certainly not confined to New York either. King Tubby in Jamaica in the 70s and 80s did similar things and like used trash cans as well as amplifiers, as non-powered amplifiers, and so put speakers, cut holes in them, put speakers in them, and it helped create the his famous like weird wah wah sound if you listen to Tubby records. And then I want to come back to the issue of reappropriation in a moment, but the issue of cost is an interesting one, and how like in the early 80s, with Public Enemy's "It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back" and "Fear of a Black Planet," even though those were like very obviously and heavily sample laden, they didn't they weren't the target of copyright infringement because there simply wasn't the legal language to speak about it, which I think is which I think is important as well. So like not only did like this new style of music create like a fundamentally different sound, but it created an entirely new legal paradigm. And we can see this uh, in the late 80s and early 90s as the lawyers really started digging their teeth into this and suing Biz Markie and De La Soul, and really trying to crack down on these artists. And, uh, and, and so as you noted, Dr. Matthews, then sampling became more and more obscure, and you had to find tracks that you potentially couldn't recognize, or even like in a more interesting manner, what early Dre and some of the other early West Coast producers did is they would play a record through one set of speakers and record it, and then sample the recording.
Mhm.
And so there, they technically weren't like, I would need to relook at like the legal definitions, but they technically then were not taking the same they were not plagiarizing to the same extent, and so they couldn't be sued uh, to the same extent. And I would need to relook at the literature on sampling jurisprudence, something that I guess I'm not all that interested in. But yeah, regarding reappropriation, I think that's a really interesting point, because as in the hip hop anthology, the introduction is written by scholar Henry Louis Gates, and he notes that the first time that he heard rapping was not under that name. It was with his grandfather calling it signifying, and according to Gates, this was an early practice that had developed out of old out of slave songs, and then and then efforts to like keep a heritage and common ancestrality alive between people, where you would retell stories but remix them ever so slightly to like fit whatever social milieu you were in. So like Wade in the Water is a really good example of a classic of a classic like uh warning, I guess, that was then reappropriated by early Black singers and commentators uh, as as times changed, and this level of signifying or playing with words uh, in the early 1900s, as Gates describes, then became what we would commonly think of as rap. And so while I think there is obviously the level of like reappropriation of like riffs from Elvis, borrowing from Black records, there's also this like unbroken lineage that extends much further than we could than one would find on a surface level analysis. And and I think this is like an interesting comment that the author Roy Christopher makes in his book Dead Precedents, is about like is specifically about how one can read sampling as an instance of the cut-up method, an instance of détournement, et cetera, détournement, et cetera. But to do that would be to elide the actual history um, of 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 uh, of sampling and remix culture as such, insofar as it far predates that. And I like now this is also an area that I don't really care about, but like Beethoven and early classical composers snagged riffs from other classical composers as well. Now
They
I
would
don't
call
really
them
give a shit about
variations. Yeah, they would call them variations.
yeah. I mean, like
And
I
it's
don't
true.
really care about Beethoven like remixing other people's work, but like this is something that has like a lineage that is far earlier than the Dadaists as well. But I think that 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 this specific instantiation is a really interesting that sampling is a really interesting instantiation of the cut-up method of détournement, et cetera. And I think and I think Kodwo Eshun in his book More Brilliant Than the Sun sums this up very nicely when he rejects resorting to theorists. He doesn't look at the SI. He doesn't look at Kristeva or in her concept of intertextuality. He says that, quote, producers are already pop theorists, and that relying on trad theory is, or traditional theory, just as trad theory is just acting like a headmaster, subduing music's ambition and reining it in, as he says. And so while obviously, because we're in the theory center and we have to rely on canonical figures, I can't go as far as Eshun and like say, okay, well, forget Kristeva and forget the SI. Although I would like to, I'm relying on very specific chunks of the SI's work. Pretty much just 2 essays in this anthology, and then Kristeva's essay on intertextuality, and then a few other like secondary sources on the SI talking about détournement, and then a bunch of like other stuff not talking about the SI at all, but talking about sample as such. I think there's a lot more to ramble about, but that was like a very disorganized and yeah, disorganized comment, maybe.
In terms of canonical thinkers, Kristeva for sure, but I thought that many of the ideas that she was presenting about the bounded text, for example, intertextuality, actually belonged to Bakhtin. And Bakhtin's idea of the polymorphous text, or the polytextuality, the fact that narratives are just ribbons of citations from elsewhere. So really, the last thing you want to do is go down the rabbit hole of who did it first, because the next thing you know, you'll be down to the 14th century if you're not careful. Helen.
Yeah, I love your paper idea, Peter. It's super cool. So one thing I was wondering is, when thinking about sampling as a kind of détournement, will you like talk more about sampling as a concept, or like a historical concept, or will you like talk about a specific artist or like groups of artists, or is that too soon to make that decision?
Yeah. So like I want to do both. abstractly, like to talk about what détournement is and what sampling is. I need to talk about it in the abstract and say, okay, well, like this is like taking bits and pieces of music, um, musical quotations, blah blah blah, splicing them together, and so like part one of the paper is just like what the hell is sampling, and that has that has recourse to Kristeva and Boss. Dr. Matthew now is gone, but when he was talking about Bakhtin, I was thinking of Roland Barthes and the death of the author, and how we see that same abstraction in Barthes, and then I do want to talk about like specific examples, only in as much as like I think they help illustrate the point, but there are like so many that I have to pick and choose, which I think is hard to do. And so like but the few people that I am focusing on would be Eric B. and Rakim, Grandmaster Flash, Jay Dilla, and MF Doom, and Public Enemy. So I think there's I'm trying to do both.
The other thing too that I wanted to point out is and we've alluded sort of back and forth, there's on the other hand, the oral culture going back to the slave days in the US, and that oral culture of carrying on a tradition, and then sort of harnessed onto the reappropriation of Black music by white artists through the use of sampling. So it's a nice kind of meshing together of one tradition that was positive, right? It viewed that those individuals in a positive way, which is the oral culture, the old oral tradition, which then eventually segues into rap. And then underneath that is the sample culture that is this kind of reappropriation of music that has been around or even sounds for that matter, and voices that have been around for a long time. And certainly when it first started, at least my experience was, and I mentioned it, that the samples were well known. There were songs people liked. This is my favorite part of that song by Chic or whatever, and the whole song was built out of it. And then later on, as money starts rolling in, people have to be much more selective or get clearance. So by this point, I would say that once a legal empire builds up around it, you're in. You're part of the mainstream, because now there is a way to legally deal with these particular samples. Then you go, DJ Shadow says, okay, you know what? I'm going to go all the way in the opposite direction. I'm going to be as obscure as hell, and good luck trying to locate any of these samples. And then you have, on top of all of that, you have like home or a DAW, right? A digital audio workshop or a workspace, which is Ableton, Fruity Loops, Pro Tools, all these reasonably inexpensive programs that people can pick up for, either you can get it off Pirate Bay for free or maybe for $100, and then the sky's the limit and off you go. So it really spawned something very unique. What individuals had to do with physical recordings, now people can do using your DAW, your workstation. You can chop up things digitally any which way you want. You can run them forwards and backwards. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking on page 16 of the user's guide to détournement, the specification of minor versus deceptive détournement. The minor one, right, simply being element which has no importance in itself. So it could be literally anything. It just it could be I sampled a speech by Winston Churchill, but it's just the words I wanted. It didn't matter who it was. And then the more deceptive ones, it says in contrast, is its intrinsically significant element. So I think there you could talk about Public Enemy using, talking about slave ships. And I'm thinking about the intro, I forget which song it is from Fear of a Black Planet. It sets a stage, and it's like a narrative, a pushing back, historical pushing back of the slavery days. And by putting this into that particular sample, it is both significant and turned on its head. Public Enemy is an absolute fave. I mean, one of the few bands you can still listen to today, and they go, yeah, they're just as radical and relevant as they were when they first came out. But the deceptive détournement, this sort of consciously juxtaposing ideas, I think Public Enemy, more so than others, did it intentionally and with a positive result. Lauryn Hill as well. Certain artists seem to pick material that, regardless of who it was or where it came from, it was the statement, the phrase that was now recontextualized, and it gave it that added power, because then it would, the song would be followed by, talking about the slave trade, or talking about injustices, or talking about whatever it may be. So it's deceptive in the sense that it has come from something clearly elsewhere, but it is that context, this recontextualization of the sample that really gives it that credence, right? That interest that piques us to listen further.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, no. I think I think that's right. In like those two sections, I obviously underlined in the user's guide. Among other parts, obviously. I would push back against two things. One is you said in passing, I don't know how serious this was, but like once you become part of the legal framework, you're part of the mainstream. And I'm not entirely sure like how true that is, insofar as like artists don't choose to be a part of the legal framework. They're sucked into it.
Yeah.
And so like De La Soul, when they sampled the Turtles, didn't like decide to like enter this this contractual agreement. They got sued, and then they and that's when the legal framework encroached upon them. And so yeah, I think I would read that in probably the inverse way. And the other thing I would say is, I think deceptive détournement is really interesting insofar as like, I don't think it has to be explicitly political either. Like, well, certainly Public Enemy, Busta Rhymes, Dr. Octagon, and countless others do have explicitly political messages. I think MF Doom is probably, like, in my opinion, one of the best examples of someone who's using deceptive détournement in a very non-political manner, and like he's taking samples from like the Spider-Man animated series, and just like in the Fantastic Four animated series, and splicing that into like his own character creation. And so in that sense, like the context does matter, because the Fantastic Four is fighting Doctor Doom, or Spider-Man's fighting Doctor Doom, but he doesn't really like care about Spider-Man as such. He cares about the persona of Doctor Doom that he's then appropriating. And so I think that like while I like very much like quote unquote conscious or like political rap, I think that it need not be seen as like the most important or the prime instance of a certain kind of détournement. I think that like
just to I guess reiterate the point, maybe semi-facetiously, that once the legal department notices you're mainstream, let me qualify that. What I mean by that is artists now, when you sign a contract with a record company, and this is based on my friend who worked for Attic Records and then moved to the record industry, and said, yeah, they would set aside a portion of their money, not in the hopes of being sued. Nobody wants to be, but they would set aside a portion of the money set aside, like for the record, just in case. So they consciously used a sample, obscure or not, and in case they get sued, they would have the money there already. So this is something that's occurred over the last, say, decade and a half. So let's say since the 2000s at the most, where there's a conscious understanding that this is the way this works. Now, it used to be, if you believe Moby, better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. And it's kind of true. And this is one of the reasons why some rap artists, or at least samplers, because again, we need to make the distinction. The individuals making the songs sonically and sampling often would pick obscure things. And the end result is that you're less likely to be sued. But now there is, at least with the recording contract, a portion of your profits will be set aside in the remote chance that you might get caught. Some people are really good. And of course, it drives old people like me nuts, because all of a sudden I just go berserk trying to figure out, what is that song? And last time it drove me nuts was a Drake tune from a few years ago, Hanging on the Line or Hanging on the Phone or whatever it was. And yeah, it was a Timmy Thomerson song. It took me an hour to finally figure it out. Hotline Bling, thank you. And I went, I know that riff, and it just drove me nuts. The one that's driving me crazy now is the new Bruno Mars song, I Leave the Door Open. I can't figure out who it is, the Delphonics or the Dramatics or some Philly sound in the early 70s. I digress. But the point is, sometimes the sample is done to conjure up an era. It may be to conjure up a specific context, but certainly from a legal point of view, sampling is recognized as simply part of making a song. I know that if I put songs together, depending on where the samplings are the sample is coming from, if I purchase them, for example, I'll be buying loops from, say, as I did a couple of years ago, from a company out of England, and it was East Indian music, and it was all vocal lines. And it actually came with not a disclaimer or a warning, but it said, we would like to, at its worst, exactly, we would like you to use this material, and we've chopped it up for you, but we would like to ask you to not do the following. Insert these sounds into songs that are either sexist or racist or demeaning to women. And it literally had a warning. Do not do this. Here are the samples. You can use them. I had to pay for them. But these beautiful vocal lines, which I could do whatever I wanted, but they were very specific as the context in which they would appear. Racist or sexist in particular, demeaning in any way, especially demeaning to an East Indian culture. That was the only thing I needed to worry about. And I, of course, wouldn't be doing that. I was so grateful to get these things. But all kinds of industries have kind of cropped up around sampling culture. I mean, these production houses out of England in particular literally sample for you. And here for $30, you like, the Amen Break, or do you like Funky Drummer? Here's 100 of these things for $20. So I have no idea where they're from, but royalty-free samples, that's exactly what that is. So it is something that is out there, and it has changed the playing field, but in a really interesting way. It's now allowed everyone to become a musician, right? Everyone, you just need to have a good ear, as to how things fit together. And the end result is that you can make all kinds of stuff. But détournement is really kind of the idea behind it, right? To take a minor little chunk of something from somewhere and insert it. Now, Chris, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's this whole kind of, I guess, polarized battle in like the online music producing communities now between like sound design and arrangements. Mm-hmm. So you can be the type of person who knows how to operate analog gear, and say you're trying to do a film score and you have synthesizers, you can say, okay, I want like a dark bassy tone, and then you have like your EQ or whatever. But you could also just go on like Splice and be like dark ambient bass loop, and you'll just get like 1,000 of them. And you can just start auditioning them and download whatever one you want. So yeah, to your point, you can arrange like film scores or do all kinds of crazy stuff now without ever like playing a single key on a keyboard or strumming a string on a guitar, which is like this bizarre, like there's so much accessibility.
Yeah.
And to Peter's point, in the presentation, which thank you, by the way, it was a really interesting idea for a paper. I think it'll be a really great paper. Like, how do you differentiate collaboration from just, because to me, like in music, when you collaborate, there's like a mutual want between both parties to work on something together. Whereas when you're sampling, it's like a unilateral collaboration where you're just like taking somebody's music and using it without like permission ahead of time. And to me, I don't know, like I feel like with something like music or anything art related, once you've made the decision that it's not just a private song on your own hard drive as that you play for like your family and friends, and you've like put it out there for the world, to your point earlier in the term, Dr. Matthews, it was like a it doesn't belong to you anymore or something like that. So it's almost like you're putting it out there into the public domain. So in my view, and I this is my question for you, Peter, and sorry for my long-winded wind up to it, but do you think people should have that right to just be able to sample whatever they want and not be sued, so long as they're not making money off? Once you start making money off the song you make with the sample, you should be required to either give all of that or a percentage of it to the original artist you sampled. But I've always thought with music, I just feel like, for example, if I put out a song and somebody sampled it, and it was just like a thing that they put on SoundCloud and they're not getting paid, to me, I wouldn't understand why somebody would want to go after them in that way. If they're making $1 million off of it and you only made a few thousand when you originally put out the song, then yeah, you're going to want to cut.
A few thousand. If you see my SOCAN checks, I'm lucky to make $4.
Yeah. 1 million streams on Spotify is like $1,000, I think. So I feel you. But yeah, that was my question, Peter. Like, do you think when sampling goes wrong, do you think like that's justified, or do you think that people should have a right to, like, if something's been released for public consumption, should you be able to reuse that, or should there be conditions on it, like intellectual property? Like, as long as it's cited, to me, it's like writing an essay. I shouldn't have to pay you because I read your paper and used it to write my paper. As long as you're on my bibliography, what's the big deal? Unless I start making money when I turn that paper into a book, then maybe I should give you part of that money. But it's an interesting kind of tension between like creativity and access to information and access to resources, and on the other hand, like, you know, people's rights over their intellectual property, whether that's, you know, academic or music. I think it's kind of a similar, maybe it is a bit of a false analogy, but I think it's a good comparison in my view, at least.
Yeah. So okay. So I think I think there were like multiple variants of I don't think it was loaded. I just think there were multiple variants of the question. I mean, so the first strong reaction is, I think intellectual property is a stupid idea. And so, like, I think, yeah, you should be free to sample whatever you want and sell it or not. And like, sure, someone can whine about it or not. And similarly, I would make a similar argument about plagiarism. That, like, I think that what we see as wrong with plagiarism, or like identifying an original author, or citing sources, or blah blah blah, which obviously we have to do because we live in this system. But I think all of that is like an outgrowth of a certain culture. Namely, I think that's an outgrowth of the culture of trying to identify individuals with ideas so as to make them punishable. and Foucault in What is an Author, I think actually expands upon this very well insofar as like authors, or we can expand this to like individual creators, become relevant only insofar as 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 states are able to exert power upon people for saying certain things. Um, and uh, and like so if one looks at like uh I almost said pseudo Heraclitus, not what's his name, pseudo shit um I'm blanking on his name now. His name doesn't even matter because it's not his actual name.
He wasn't the author of what he said.
Yeah. One of the medieval theologians who um pseudo something, who wasn't actually that person. Like when we look at medieval philosophy, we see like there's stuff that's like just like repeated or copied, and commented upon, and it just goes through iterations of this, and like nobody cares. Um, it just becomes more interesting over time, and you can see this in the context, like you see this in the context of like a ton of quote unquote ancient works, like um like Torah commentary or Kabbalah, um, but only once we have this like regime of individuals that need to be held accountable for their actions, uh, do then like ideas of authorship and ownership really matter. Um, and again, I think Foucault's essay, "What is an Author?" thoroughly problematizes that, and expanding upon that, Both's Death of an Author uh, really like jumps with that as well. And so I'm inclined to say like I'm inclined to be reactionary in the sense that like um, I don't care about the individual. And in the sense of like I don't care about like some static individual that like has intellectual property rights or like owns or owns what they say or something. I think yeah, you should be able to remix that and um, sell it or use it or do whatever. Um, and I also think the more like the more interesting issue is the one that you brought up at the very beginning, which I'm still working through, and I would need to now relook at a couple examples, but the collaboration versus unilateral usage, um, and like uh, my gut reaction is to say that everything is collaboration, um, but I would need to add qualifiers to that I haven't yet thought about. And so
Yeah, like it almost, sorry, really, really brief point, but like the issue with collaboration, like the English lit stuff I did in my MA, that you can look at it in the early moderns too, like with playhouses that were collaborative. And does the fact that, you know, a stagehand or an actor might have edited a line or tweaked a scene in the different versions of Hamlet mean that Shakespeare isn't the sole author of Hamlet, similar to how people who might have been involved in one or two songs on the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, does that mean that she's not the primary songwriter? Or is it now like an APA psych paper where like the most important author's names first, but then everybody else involved has to be listed as well? And where do you draw those lines, right? Like it's such a weird context specific thing. And that's where I think the problem is we're trying to make like universal laws on collaboration, or like in terms of like fitting it into this legal capitalist system in terms of like monetizing the art of music. We're trying to create these like laws that apply across like a broad set of situations that aren't the same at all, right? It's like the problem of making any law. Like it's not going to fit all contexts as well as others, and you just hope that it fits most of the time pretty well, and therefore is good enough or whatever. But to me, it's just such a like a tricky thing to delineate. Like when did because you could get into like, okay, well, we had a conversation in between takes, and the conversation that we had made me go and like change this word and this verse of the song. But did the fact that you and I discussed this, does that now mean that you are a collaborator? Because I was the one who made the decision and I didn't ask for your permission before finalizing that version. So yeah, like it's almost like a weird hierarchy between like, I don't know, like collaboration and then remixing, and then sampling is like reshaping or like recreating or something, whereas a remix. But now with remixing too, it's so weird because you get a remix that uses the lyrics of a song on a completely different beat in a different genre, right? Like you take that Roses song turned into an EDM hit over like the last summer, and that was like completely reshaped it, like pitched his vocals up a couple octaves and like used some formant or whatever, right? So it's such a weird evolution from these problems that you've outlined in kind of the birth of sampling to where we stand now. It's just yeah, it's really cool to think about, and I think it's interesting to think about it in relation to the SI, especially as it insofar as like capitalism more or less, I guess, can devalue art or like make it like the thing that I'm thinking of is how art can like almost only express like alienation or something like that. So I don't know if oh, you guys, I think you're frozen, so I'm not sure if you can hear me anymore. But
I can hear you, but oh, there you are. You just came back. I know, Paishini, you've had your hand up, and then Maxwell
sorry,
as well. Peter,
turned
did you
into
wish...
a bit of a ramble there.
No, that's okay. Peter, did you wish to respond to Chris's point, or is it kind of a self-contained?
No, I'll cede the floor.
Okay, all right. Paishini first, and then Maxwell.
I don't have anything to say. I just wanted to bring up something that I noticed recently, which was that a friend of mine who's taking a few classes and doing his PhD somewhere in India told me that over the 2 semesters he had taught, almost no student from his class ever cited anyone, and almost all of them plagiarized multiple people, multiple papers, and sometimes they plagiarized each other, and all of that. And he was really fed up with it. But what we realized over time is that it was not that these were bad students, or, I mean, of course, you can practically hold the university accountable, but the fact of the matter was that the students, especially in lots of public universities, which are not equipped in the way private universities are, just do not have a concept of this is my idea or this is this author's idea. And so if I take this author's idea, I must mention the name of this author or whatever. So that's an interesting thing. And with respect to intellectual property, I mean, if I agree with whatever Peter said, and if it did sort of, I don't know, defend in some way or protect people who were more vulnerable or whose ideas were appropriated by rich, popular, whatever, famous artists or whatever, I would be all for it. But it does also seem that with that sort of a law, and with that sort of the kind of legal procedure and power that necessitates, is also for a very specific sort of legal subject, which is not a universal subject. It's a very specific kind of modern subject. So that's all.
Thank you.
But yeah, thanks for the presentation.
Maxwell, you wanted to add something?
Can I clarify one point real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to say, actually, yeah, no. I think that's really interesting. And the way I view like citations in academia, is not so much as like, is not so much like, oh, X person had this idea, but rather like shouting them out, say like, hey, look at this other cool stuff. Like that's like, I mean, apart from like not getting like kicked out or whatever, or because we somehow care about this shit. Like that's really the only reason I think that it's like interesting. But yeah, okay, Maxwell.
Yeah.
So thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to sort of bring up some points of tension that I'm hearing. One, like right from the beginning, bringing up Zara's cut up technique. And as we've kind of talked about between minor and what's the other one? Deceptive.
Yeah.
Yeah. That seems to me to be between, like, in terms of Dadaist cut up technique and ready-made. These are very different techniques with very different kind of, just getting a weird pop-up. These are very different techniques with very, very different kind of goals, and especially in relation to détournement. And the thing that I'm surprised that I'm not hearing, unless I missed it, is that this kind of like R&B, hip hop, rap tradition is not, for me, like cut up technique, because that, like, the kind of schizophrenic relationship there is very different when you overlay a unified, consistent voice over top of a mess of background voices. Like the switch there is just different to me. Like, I'm thinking more of like Girl Talk or Amon Tobin as sampling musicians, which are obviously, it's a totally different genre, but I feel like there's a tension in schizophrenia in terms of these different kinds of sampling techniques. And I also wanted to bring up, like, in terms of Foucault, the order of things, similitude and representation. If we're going to talk about legal systems, these are representational systems. And it seems like we're looking for some sort of dialogical, like, negotiation between points when it's actually built on distinct points of reference between identity and then how those things are different from one another, instead of this like fluid shift between things where like the citations in that framing aren't points so much as just a conversation versus I am a person that owns something. Like, that's a very different kind of dead end. So I just wanted to bring up like a slew of different things to think about and navigate.
Yeah, no, I think I think that's interesting. I would be interested to hear more about the latter comment regarding the first point about the sampling not necessarily being a cut up insofar as it has a different, like, quote unquote schizophrenic relationship. I think it's entirely contingent upon, like, who we're talking about. So I would argue that that like Jay Dilla's samples are much closer to like the like traditional cut up technique than say the samples of Doom, which tell a story. Because Dilla is taking a song, chopping it up and saying, hey, like, look what I can do with this. It doesn't have to tell a coherent story, but like, I can do cool shit with this and you can't. Whereas Doom is like weaving a narrative through a bunch of different samples. And I'd say the former is significantly more schizo in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, and the latter is not. But I think you're right that like all sampling is a conscious activity, and so you're not going to get the same unconscious like drawing words out of a hat type activity that that was emblematic of like the cut up of Dadaists. But that being said, I think it's important to note that like Burroughs also was like, well, you don't need to like not edit cut ups. You can edit them, which is re-imbuing a sense of like subjectivity or your own consciousness within them. and so I guess it's like, well, how pure do we want the cut-ups to remain, right? Like, do they have to be words drawn out of a hat, or can you do something with them?
Maxwell, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I want to refine my statement because I'm realizing I was a bit heavy-handed. My issue with attaching this to Zara is like methodologically, there's a lot of similarities, but in terms of reception, in a cut up of found words, there's no citation or like very little. I would like the chances that I'm going to look at a font and be like, oh, that's from Critical Inquiry, like I know where you're getting that from, is basically nil. But as like Ed, you were really getting into this, you hear a riff and your brain like immediately switches over, like I know that's from somewhere. And that difference to me is a totally different relationship because of the cultural ties to it. Like methodologically for the artist, they're similar, but in terms of reception, I just like I want a gap there that recognizes that, which like granted, maybe not relevant for your argument, but seems like an important avenue to have somewhere like on the side.
Mm-hmm. Peter, I was just going to say before you answer, you had mentioned originally in your presentation, Eric B. and Rakim Paid in Full and the Afrahaza sample, which at that time, Afrahaza was unknown in North America, still a fairly popular singer in the Middle East and out of Israel. But that song, first of all, blew up huge globally. It caught the attention of the managers of Afrahaza, and it was mutually beneficial for everyone. So the schizophrenia that you talk about, Maxwell, when it first came out, I mean, it was a heavy, heavy beat, and over top is this, what we thought was Arabic singing. It wasn't. It was this unusual juxtaposition of literally two different styles of music, but somehow coexisting and complementing one another. And this is something that I've heard many other times done in trip hop, ambient, you know, where you have different languages being spoken, different styles of music coexisting. Now, the juxtaposition or the schizophrenic part is it's temporary. We seem to sort of kind of get into the groove, and we sort of understand why it was chosen, because you know certain inflections of the voice, you know, certain sounds that are emanating from that person's individual voice and words, etc. Even if we don't understand the words, so the juxtaposition can be there when it first starts out. And Paid in Full was probably for me the earliest example of hearing something that you would have not expected, sung, of course, in a different language, but ultimately worked really, really well. So I don't know, Peter, if you want to address that, because that's typically the way I work. I try to find two completely disparate things. I mean, dub reggae and Ligeti music, right? And I'll chop them both up, throw them together and go, oh, look, it works. Well, yeah, because it has a rhythm. If nothing else, rhythmically it ties together. So I don't know, Peter, if you want to address that in terms of what Maxwell has raised.
Yeah, I mean, like, so what I think about when you say that is I think about uh, two things. First is Nas's song "I Can," which the bass sample is not like the sample of like bass, but like the bass sample is Beethoven,
Yeah.
and it's like a brilliant song, and it works perfectly. And it's like these two types of music that are like seemingly radically distinct, like classical piano and like what Nas calls street hop.
Yeah.
And it's so there's that, and then in the context of like different languages, like there's this really the producer J Period has like a bunch of really cool mashups of Biggie Smalls with other artists, and like there's this really interesting one where he's mashed up Biggie with this Nigerian rapper Wizkid, and so you have like half the song in Nigerian and half the song in like Brooklyn English, and it's like if you don't know Nigerian, which I don't, you can't tell what the hell Wizkid's saying, but like it's cool nevertheless,
Yeah.
and it fits, and and then I guess I want to real quick circle back around to what Maxwell said about the reception, because like I think you're right that there is that there is a distinction insofar as like if I read something, I might not know where like a piece of text is from. But if I hear a song, I can recognize like a Hall and Oates beat or something. But I would make the argument that the only reason that's the case is because we are more rhythmic animals than we are textual animals. And if if humans had evolved with like now we're going to get into like Derrida, which I really don't want to get into. But like
That's not a problem.
yeah, but so I'm just gonna leave Derrida on the shelf and not bring him out. But like but if we had grown if we had evolved textually as opposed to like rhythmically, I think that that things would be flipped, right? And we would notice we would notice words as coming from various people or cultures as opposed to songs coming from various groups. And I think we even can to some extent, like various people use certain words, and but yeah, Maxwell, I think.
Maxwell.
So not to dispute that, but again, just to refine, like Zara cutting up words and putting them in a bag, so they're just distinct words. Would it be like vision versus rhythm, but in a really like handicapped way for vision? I think that comparison here might be between like, or more closely related between like the Arcades project and like music sampling, or like something. When you're talking about textual sort of relations, I would still call that, like in terms of citing full sentences or paragraphs, there's still a rhythm there. There's still a kind of speech. There's still like kinds of ideas that show up. Like maybe I'm just mincing words, but again, like I feel like we need to introduce another kind of refinement on this methodology.
Just to interject, if we're speaking of the rhythm of words, Steve Reich, an American composer who's been working since the early 60s, famously did not tape cut-ups, but recordings of people, and would simply take one simple little a line, and then he would begin to manipulate it sonically, like he would put reverb on it, and then he would speed it up, slow it down. Come out to show them is one, and the line is it's a young person of color who's describing that he's been shot or stabbed, and he says, so I showed it to the doctor, and so the blood was coming out, so they come out to show them, and Steve Reich takes his little line and just starts playing with it, and eventually it's just these cool rhythmic sounds that literally destroy all meaning, but it reinvents itself rhythmically because we have the reverb, and come out to show them that line eventually just becomes gibberish. It's Going to Rain is another one. These really brilliant early 60s exercises where it was a single sample, but the sample was explored in a range of sonic ways that would allow us to realize that people speak rhythmically, right? We speak with meaning, but our voices, our words, individual syllables are very rhythmic, and we may put emphasis on various sounds. It was an interesting exercise, and certainly one that set the ground or the foundation for what would become sampling culture later on, to make the distinction. Peter, just one last thing we wanted to ask you was, when you're talking about sampling, the idea that Burroughs was saying that when you do cut up, the future seeps through. Whenever I do stuff where I'm chopping things up and I like to keep things disparate, I like to imagine a world where everybody gets along, like a world, like a kind of a UN version of a musical world where I have East Indian melodies playing in the background, and someone rapping or speaking in English, and then I've got sounds coming from somewhere else, and it's a real kind of polyglot sort of thing. But I imagine the world getting along, right? And people getting along with each other sonically, in the hopes that maybe we can, in the real way, or in the real sense. And that's kind of my motivation. I try to put things that well, again, not shouldn't, but don't usually belong together. And by putting them together, I have someone singing in Urdu over a dub beat, and then I have something else thrown in, and I might have some, something I sample from a Mahler symphony because it's just a cool sound. And I just mix this magical world that doesn't exist, but I hope that in the future is going to. Now, I get that from the Jacques Attali book that I mentioned to you, Noise. That's one of the main sort of ideas towards the tail end. He says, we can do that. We can create a world that will hopefully reflect what is in the future. I don't know if you had some final thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly one way of looking about it, of trying to intentionally create a future. I'm more inclined to think that like we can't do that. Rather, that is to say, we can't intentionally like plan out a future. Rather, our engagement with these like purely libidinal activities allows for like our unconscious to play with potentialities and for a future to seep out. So like I'm not so sure that if we're creating a sample-based song, like using a bunch of languages, the world that we are creating is I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think we can intentionally create a world. I think the world auto creates itself out of like the ooze that comes out of our mashing stuff together. Yeah, like I don't know. There's I would return to Fisher probably and just be like, the future's canceled. We can't think about the future. The only way to like get there is to push through some breaking point. And then I would offhandedly reference like Eshun and Lyotard and the other accelerationists, but that would be like a cheap answer that I'm giving in the last like 5 minutes. So.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for your presentation and for everyone else for critical commentary and ideas to explore further. And as Chris had mentioned last week, it turned out to be very beneficial. Peter, the same thing. Certainly not everything that was discussed, but perhaps it'll give you a new perspective on what you already have to refine or clarify some ideas that we've discussed today. I believe next week is Paushini, right? You'll be presenting, okay, on alienation and the spectacle. And again, that's just a working title. So thank you very much again. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up because I have a class in less about 12 minutes, but I want to be able to save this this recording. So I will post that shortly. And I think that is pretty well it. We're kind of moving along in the last, got a month and a bit, more or less. It's flying along very quickly. So everyone have a wonderful week. It's kind of nice out there. So we can all step outside and breathe in. And if you remember that scene from The Simpsons after the big storm to the sound of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, of all things, we're all looking around. So I think we might all get over this together. So the good weather is upon us. Anyway, have a good week, everyone, and take care. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.